A discredited government investigation into alleged abuses committed by British soldiers in Iraq is being shut down. A report by MPs called it an unmitigated failure that had cost tens of millions of pounds.
This will be a huge relief to hundreds of British troops who've had these quite unfair allegations hanging over them. They're now being freed of that.
Me and my fellow soldiers and my regiment going through a 10-year, tarnish, and it's just not on and it's not fair.
The government's announced that most of the investigation into abuse allegations from Afghanistan will also be dropped. Also tonight, the Health Secretary admits waiting times in A&E in hospitals in England are completely unacceptable. Donald Trump vows to fight on, despite a court refusing to reinstate his controversial travel ban. Over 400 whales beached themselves on the coast of New Zealand. Volunteers battle to save them. And England get ready for the clash in Cardiff in their Six Nations game against Wales.
Here, this taxi driver's doing the right thing, but hundreds of others are breaking the law and refusing to take guide dogs. And a new leisure complex opens in Southampton, but does it signal an economic revival?
Good evening. A controversial investigation costing tens of millions of pounds into claims of the abuse of Iraqi civilians by British troops is to be shut down within months. It follows a scathing report by MPs into the Iraq Historic Allegations team, which it described as an unmitigated failure, investigating thousands of claims unsupported by credible evidence, and that soldiers under investigation had suffered unacceptable stress. 90% of investigations into abuse allegations from Afghanistan are also being dropped. Our diplomatic correspondent Caroline Hawley has the story.
It's almost 14 years since British troops invaded Iraq, and the legacy of the war is still causing controversy. In the aftermath of the occupation, thousands of allegations of abuse were made against British soldiers, and a special team called IHAT was set up to investigate them. The human rights lawyer Phil Shiner brought most of the claims, but last week he was struck off after he'd been found to be dishonest and to have paid agents to drum up business. And now the Ministry of Defence is wrapping up the investigation early.
This will be a huge relief to hundreds of British troops who've had these quite unfair allegations hanging over them. They're now being freed of that, and we will put in place new measures now to ensure this never happens again, that there are proper safeguards to prevent completely malicious and unfounded allegations being made against our brave servicemen and women.
The most serious allegations to be made were of murder and mutilation after this battle in 2004. The claims were false. A soldier who was there, decorated for his bravery, told us of the pain he'd been put through.
You're under so much pressure on operations as it is. And when you hold your values and standards at the highest regard, to then come back and have that questioned for your actions you did on the ground, which you thought were right under extreme pressure, in extreme circumstances, to come home, it's damaging for individuals and also for the regiment and the British Army as a whole.
There's no doubt that some abuses did happen in Iraq. These were detainees being beaten in Basra in 2003. And over the past few years, the Ministry of Defence has paid out millions in compensation. But the Iraq Historic Allegations team has been widely criticised for getting out of hand. It was set up 7 years ago and has had to plough through more than 3,000 claims. It's cost over £34 million. But no soldiers have been prosecuted as a result.
IHAT and its work has always been controversial within the military, but the downfall of Phil Shiner and mounting concern over the toll it was taking on former soldiers and their families has led the MOD to act.
I think this is something that will be really important. It'll make a big statement to the Army, and most importantly of all, I think it shows that the government is four square behind supporting the Army and providing it with the appropriate framework in which our soldiers can deal with those very difficult operational decisions that they have to deal with.
Of all the allegations made over the course of Britain's long involvement in Iraq, the Ministry of Defence now says that by the summer, only about 20 will be left to be investigated.
And Caroline, there's been growing controversy about the Iraq investigations team for some time, but presumably it's today's report by MPs that's finally finished it off.
Well, the MOD has certainly been under real pressure over the investigation, which has been running for 7 years with 130 staff and no prosecutions. Most of the cases in front of it had already been dismissed for lack of evidence. Then last week you had Phil Shiner being struck off, and he'd brought most of the claims in front of the Iraq Historic Allegations team. Then this blistering attack by MPs on the investigation, calling it an unmitigated failure, and it was just after their report was issued that the MOD announced it was wrapping up the investigation early, wrapping it up by the summer, saying that there'll only be about 20 cases left, and the Royal Navy Police will now take those on. And it's also announced, as you said, that 90% of the allegations of abuse made in Afghanistan will now be discontinued as well.
Okay, Caroline, thank you. The Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, says it's completely unacceptable that some patients in England are waiting up to 13 hours in A&E. Figures show that waiting times in casualty are worse than at any time in the last decade, and the number of operations cancelled at the last minute hit a 15-year high last year. Mr Hunt insists he does have an improvement plan, though he didn't reveal it, and he admits it will take time. He was talking to our health editor, Hugh Pym.
The worst monthly A&E figures in more than a decade.
We actually have corridor nurses now as well. It shows times are very desperate.
Images like this across BBC News.
No one would want it for members of their own family.
It's been a difficult few days for the Health Secretary. Now he's come out and acknowledged that some of what's happening in England's hospitals is unacceptable.
The BBC has shown images from Royal Blackburn of people waiting 13 hours, mothers and babies sitting in the corridor. Aren't you embarrassed about that?
Well, it is, incredibly frustrating for me. I'm doing this job because I want NHS care to be the safest and best in the world, and that kind of care is completely unacceptable. No one would want it for members of their own family.
We featured Iris Sibley's story this week. She had to wait 6 months in hospital before a care home place was available. What did Mr Hunt have to say to her family?
Well, I don't want to make any kind of excuses for that. It is totally unacceptable. It is terrible for Mrs Sibley, but it's also very bad for the NHS because other people could have...
But it's not the only case of its kind.
No, and as I say, there are no excuses. It is completely unacceptable.
Iris's son John said he was pleased Mr Hunt had recognised that his mother had been let down, but he had this message for the Health Secretary.
What I'd like to say to Jeremy Hunt is to admit, to have the guts to admit that the system for social funding is broken. If we have to pay more, I'd say to Jeremy Hunt, I'm prepared to pay more tax. And I'm sure most of the country would be too, because our old people are worth it.
And the state of social care was something I raised with Mr Hunt.
The Prime Minister has been very clear. We recognise the pressures there. We recognise there is a problem about the sustainability of the social care system, and that has to be addressed, and we're going to do that.
There have been calls for more funding for the NHS in England, including from an American health expert who advised David Cameron and Jeremy Hunt. He thinks the government's current spending plans are set too low.
I have serious doubts as to whether you can have a health care that's universal, not rationed, and responsive to needs at that target level. So I'm concerned.
But others say it's not just about money, and getting the NHS to be more efficient is important, with new ways of working the real priority. Mr Hunt says change is needed on many fronts.
I think it's wrong to suggest to people that these profound challenges, such as we face with an ageing population, are ones where there's a silver bullet that you can solve the problem overnight. We also need the public's help, because we know that a number of the people who are seen in A&Es could actually have their needs dealt with in another part of the NHS.
New figures show cancelled operations in England were up 16% last year. Further evidence that whether it's routine surgery, A&E or community care, there's pressure right across the NHS. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
President Trump has hit back after a US court refused to reinstate his temporary ban on travellers from 7 mainly Muslim countries. This evening, Mr. Trump said there was no doubt he would win in the courts, and he pledged additional security measures next week. Our North America editor John Sopel has the latest on the president's confrontation with the legal system.
Ready, At the White House this morning, a full ceremonial welcome being laid on for the Japanese Prime Minister. Even an awkward bear hug for the man he's only met once before. The focus of the conversation was meant to be about trade, not the subject that journalists wanted to talk about.
I'm curious about yesterday's ruling in the Ninth Circuit Court. Has it caused you to rethink your use of executive power?
Well, your question was unrelated to what we're here for today, but I'll answer it.
He steered clear of attacking the judges and promised victory eventually.
We'll be doing something very rapidly having to do with additional security for our country. You'll be seeing that sometime next week. In addition, we will continue to go through the court process, and ultimately I have no doubt that we'll win that particular case.
Last night there was a furious reaction to the judgment, with the president tweeting in block capitals, a sure sign of irritation, "See you in court. The security of our nation is at stake." In Washington state, which brought the original case, a mixture of defiance and bring it on.
We have seen him in court twice, and we're 2 for 2. We respect that the president has broad authority when it comes to issuing executive orders, but they still have to follow the Constitution. That's the bottom line.
The sudden implementation of the executive order brought chaos to America's airports. Travellers from 7 mainly Muslim countries were banned from entering the US for 90 days. The entire refugee programme suspended for 120 days, except when it comes to Syria, and there the suspension is indefinite. The 3 federal appeal court judges ruled that there is no evidence that any alien from any countries named in the order has perpetrated a terrorist attack in the United States. The safety valve for the most vulnerable people offered no explanation for how these waiver provisions would function in practice. And in conclusion, the judges say, competing public interests do not justify a stay. In other words, the decision of the lower court will not be overturned. The next and last legal stop is the Supreme Court. With 1 vacancy still to be filled, is split evenly between 4 Liberal and 4 Conservative justices. If they were to tie, then the judgment of the lower court would be upheld.
The President and his advisers have a tough decision to make. Do they press on, take this to the Supreme Court and risk another defeat? Or rip up the existing executive order, redraft it and admit that they got it wrong in the first place? Not easy choices.
The President promised during the campaign that he would win so much Americans would get bored of winning. This is not the story so far on his migrant ban.
All right, thank you, Press.
Thank you, everybody.
John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Meanwhile, President Trump and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping have held their first telephone conversation. During the call, described as cordial, Mr. Trump agreed to honour the so-called One China policy, which he'd previously threatened to re-examine. It relates to the status of the island of Taiwan, which has its own government, but which Beijing sees as a breakaway province. The One China policy acknowledges there is only one Chinese government and that diplomatic relations must be with China, not Taiwan. Our China editor Carrie Gracie reports from the Taiwanese capital, Taipei.
People in Taiwan have more freedom of expression than people in China. After 70 years of governing itself, this noisy democracy has a mind of its own. Taiwan even has political satire. In this animation studio, they're not just mocking their own president, but Mr. Xi and Mr. Trump as well.
I mean, we have 1,800 missiles pointed our way, but at the same time, you know, in Taiwan, we have absolute freedom to do anything we want. So, you know, I think satire is definitely one of the good things that we need to push because it helps Taiwan get its name out there.
Beijing doesn't do satire. It's threatened to retake Taiwan by force. And it sailed its aircraft carrier past the island last month to show that it means business. For Beijing, the island of Taiwan, is the last piece in a jigsaw. It's the piece they say will finally reunite a nation broken up and humiliated by colonial powers 2 centuries ago. To let Taiwan float off towards independence, or even worse, to let it become part of an American-led alliance against China in these waters, well, that to Beijing would be unthinkable. The Taiwanese Navy is no match for China's. It's the American fleet which protects Taiwan. Back in December, it looked as if Donald Trump would go further. He took a call from the Taiwanese president and hinted at recognition for Taiwan. Now President Trump has backed down. In his phone call with President Xi, he returned to the so-called One China policy that Beijing insists on. And many Taiwanese reluctantly accept the status quo.
Ideally, I'd choose independence, but in the real world, independence is impossible. It would mean war with China.
Messages of peace for the year ahead at Taipei's Lantern Festival. But their future is fragile, caught between an unpredictable America and an implacable China. Their hopes and fears a low priority to both. Carrie Gracie, BBC News, Taipei.
The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is continuing his reshuffle following the resignation of several shadow cabinet ministers and a rebellion by Labour MPs over the Brexit bill. One of the big tests of his leadership will be the by-elections on the 23rd of February in the Labour-held seats of Stoke-on-Trent Central and Copeland. Our deputy political editor, John Pienaar, has been talking to voters in both constituencies.
This is BBC Radio Stoke.
Why is Labour up against it? You only have to ask.
John Pienaar's in Hanley, and he wants to know how people feel about the by-election in Stoke-on-Trent Central.
Is Stoke going to stay a Labour city?
Hopefully not.
Why do you say that?
I think for far too long we've been taken for granted by Labour.
I'd like to think it was going to stay Labour. They sort of work for everybody, don't they? Whereas, I don't know, I think the guys that are potentially going to get in are quite bigoted in a couple of the views.
Hi, Phil.
By all accounts, the Labour candidate is a pro-European. So how does that square with such a, 70% plus anti-European vote for Stoke Central?
You've been Labour, you're switching. That's what you said.
Might most probably switch this year, yes.
Well, we're still agonising a bit about it.
We're still agonising.
This is a really big deal in national politics, isn't it? Why?
Is Labour's traditional support in industrial towns like this one in Stoke, away from London and the big cities, is it deserting? Well, look, most people here voted to leave the European Union. Most of the MPs here, the Labour MPs here, voted and campaigned to stay in the European Union. And Jeremy Corbyn, look, he's popular with his party members. When it comes to the wider public, not so much. A senior Labour MP has said that Labour here is hanging on by its fingernails against the challenge of the UK Independence Party. Messages, thousands, came in on our BBC Facebook Live page. Jeremy Corbyn was a big election issue for Labour. Full of honesty, respect and integrity, said Stephen. Corbynites are enthusiastic, but he cost votes. And plenty more of the same. Labour has reason to worry. Every voter's a prize just now. Labour's under siege in 2 by-elections on the same night. Voters who never wanted Brexit are being targeted by the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. Will UKIP's campaigners see their leader become Stoke's new MP? That'd strike fear into Labour's Brexit-supporting heartlands.
So we're on Acorn Bank.
Tory campaigners are daring to dream of an historic triumph. They ran UKIP close in Stoke, but in Copeland they feel they can beat Labour, the first government gain over its main opponents in a by-election in 35 years. So Labour's fighting door to door, street to street here in Stoke and far to the north, where Labour's facing a hard slog to survive in a very different setting. In Copeland's coastal town of Whitehaven, Sellafield employs thousands. Ask almost anyone. Jeremy Corbyn's past opposition to nuclear power counts against his party, though voting Labour here is an old habit.
Well, I'm going to stay with Labour.
because I just think it's for the working people, and all my family's always done labour.
Because of the workforce at Sellafield and what it creates in the wider community, and what Mr Corbyn said about nuclear power, they've got to think of themselves, and for the long-term future of Sellafield, it possibly will go Conservative.
Holding this seat looks tough. Losing here or in Stoke means talk of existential crisis for Labour, rejected by once loyal voters who now feel left out and left behind. John Pienaar, BBC News, Whitehaven.
And to see a full list of candidates for both the Stoke-on-Trent Central and Copeland by-elections, you can have a look at our website at bbc.co.uk/politics. Let's take a brief look at some of the day's other news stories now. And the UK's biggest domestic energy supplier, British Gas, has said it will freeze its prices until the summer. But Scottish Power has announced that its customers will see their bills go up following similar moves from EDF and npower. Concerns have been raised about the effectiveness of Britain's naval fleet after it emerged that none of the 7 attack submarines are at sea on active operations. The newest submarines, which carry cruise missiles, cost more than £1 billion each. The MOD insists some are operationally capable. Cocaine worth up to £50 million has washed up on beaches near Great Yarmouth in Norfolk. Holdalls containing over 300 kilos of the drug were found. Detectives said it would be a major blow to the organised criminals involved. A London-based plumbing firm has lost a legal battle over whether it should give freelance workers basic employment rights such as pensions, holiday and sick pay. Pimlico plumbers went to the Court of Appeal after a plumber, Gary Smith, who was on a self-employed contract, won a tribunal case against them. More than 400 whales have beached on the coast of New Zealand, one of the worst whale strandings ever seen in the country. Volunteers in the community of Fair Whale Spit are racing to save and refloat them, but around 300 have already died and time is running out for the rest. Stranded, distressed and barely alive. Volunteers have come from far and wide to save the whales beached in New Zealand overnight, but most of them were already dead.
Yeah, this is the 3rd largest mass stranding that we've recorded in our history, and so it's a very large one. Logistically, it's a massive undertaking. The whales started stranding last night, around about 10 o'clock last night. We were notified of that, and then this morning when they went out and checked on them, most of the whales were already dead.
I've never experienced death like this before. You know, it's for such a majestic animal, it's really strange to see them doing this.
There's a lot of death there, which is a sad thing. But hey, if we can get some of them out, then it's got to be a good thing.
Scientists don't know exactly why whales beach themselves, but it can be due to sickness or injury.
Anybody that doesn't have a sheet over their whale, make sure those sheets are really, really nice and wet, not covering the blowhole.
Rescuers tried to refloat some of the whales at high tide, but some just turned straight back to shore. Whale strandings in New Zealand are common. Just 2 years earlier, 200 whales beached here. But this is one of the country's worst mass strandings. It's another weekend of fierce rivalry, intense pressure and big expectations in the Six Nations tournament. England take on Wales tomorrow, and if England win, they will be just 3 games away from breaking the world record for the most unbeaten test matches, a title currently held by New Zealand. Italy take on Ireland, and Scotland play France on Sunday. Here's our sports correspondent, Joe Wilson.
Long before the bridge, there was rugby. The journey to Wales has petrified England, their coach reflected this week. Why? History. In 2013, Wales scored 30 points in Cardiff. England humbled. The coach says it's just another city. The beer tastes the same as home. Yes, but in Cardiff it's named after the Welsh captain, Alan Wynne Jones, you see.
The game does mean a lot to a lot of people. We're able to share that. Hopefully we can share it in a positive manner. I think we're very fortunate to have a stadium that is suitable or adds to the occasion.
We've experienced lights, fire, music. England's Jones, Eddie, now expects what he calls shenanigans.
What are the shenanigans you're prepared for, Eddie?
Well, I don't know, but, you know, they're a cunning lot, the Welsh, aren't they? Yeah, they always have been. And,
Yeah, they got goats, they got daffodils, they got everything. So who knows? Who knows?
Oh, mischievous, friendly rivalry. That's what the Six Nations should be about. It is an outlet for passion. And that's exactly why England have decided that here in Cardiff, the roof should be open for the game, allowing all that Welsh noise to escape into the sky. Well, everyone in professional sport is trying to find an edge. Gareth Southgate, yes, the England football manager, was at rugby training this week, seeking a different perspective. Was that handball? No. Well, England fly half George Ford finished the session and then told me he won't be in Wales in fear.
I think as a player, if you learn to embrace it and learn to be excited about it, I think that's the best way to approach it. If you look back and you feel like you didn't enjoy it, you probably regret that.
Yes, look to the future. After their scintillating victory over Ireland last weekend, Scotland suddenly looked like the team to beat in the Six Nations. France away for them on Sunday. Daunting? Well, Paris is just another city. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
That's it. You can, of course, get more on all of those stories over on the BBC News channel. But now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Bye-bye.